I've been integrating in React in my Rails apps for a little while now. I started by just using the React Rails gem, which this just lets you get React integrated into your Rails app with a helper really simply. You get a nice React component helper and you put in your view, you pass data from your controller, and you can easily get React integrated. But then you'll find as you scale up your app, and you've seen a lot of conversations about Flux and how it helps with scalable apps, you'll probably start wanting to play with Flux. Now, most of the Flux code out there revolves around NPM and that whole ecosystem. And I found it really hard to get Flux integrated into React Rails using sprockets. As I played with it more, I started to figure out how I could do that, and I got Alt integrated into my React Rails stack on top of the React Rails gem. So I just wanted to show everyone how I get this set up and get you going from your Rails stack to React, Rails, and Flux. Let's start by making a new Rails app. And we're just going to do a to-do app for this. We're going to use Ajax to interact with like Rails as an API, just like create some to-dos, list them out, and all that. We're going to start by just doing it through Ajax, and then we'll add Flux on top of that using Ajax with Flux. So let's start by making the to-do resource. We'll have a name, and we'll have a checked. Let's open this up too. Here we go. Okay, now let's go to the React Rails gem. Let's add that into our gem file. Let's bundle. Then we'll install it using this. This just sets up all the files you'll need for it. Okay, so it essentially it just creates you a components file that calls all of your stuff in your components, and this is where all your React code goes. And actually, it's like this is what like shows like what React Rails is built for. It's built for just React components. So we're actually going to rename this to React because it's going to have your actions and your stores in there as well. So it's kind of like outside of the scope of just components now. Let's get rid of this too. We don't need the require tree. Now let's add a page for us to have the root go to. And we'll just go to the index, so like the to-do list. And then let's add that to our controller. Let's go into the views. Let's add a template. And we'll just use the React component helper. And all it's going to do is just get the to-do index component. And now let's add that component. I'm going to use CoffeeScript for this tutorial, by the way. So now let's, this is a CoffeeScript syntax for React, but I'm going to use a div and an h1. I'm just going to add a title at the top of it. And so now we have to expose it over Windows, so that way the helper can access it. Then we'll call react.create class. And then we'll just have a render function. And we'll just have a div and a h1, and we'll just say to-do list to start. And then let's start up a server. Yeah, start up a server. And we'll go over here. Oops, migrations. Now we can run the server. Oops, I need to save that. There we go. So now we got the React component going. Now let's get some data listed out on here. So I'm going to start by going to the seeds file, and I'm just going to create some to-dos. Let's run that. Break db seed. So we just get some seed data in there. Now let's go to our index controller, and let's get all the to-dos to list out. And we're going to pass that into the properties of the React component here. I'm going to use JBuilder to pass the data in from the controller to the component. I just like passing it in JSON. It just feels right because React's built well to take JSON data and render it out. So we'll make an index.json.jbuilder. So basically we just take the to-dos, and then I'm going to actually make a partial because I like to have modular JBuilder code, and it's just going to get all those to-dos and get them, render them in the partials JSON. So here, json.jbuilder, and then we just do json.extract to-do. Then we want the ID, the name, and the checked. And now we just need to pass it in to the component. So we're just going to call the render template, and then we just pass in the index that we just made. So to-dos index.json.jbuilder, and it will pick up the instance variable because we defined it right there. Let's save this. And now we just need to render that out in the component here. So I'm actually going to get Lodash because I like to use Lodash to do things like mapping. So let me get the code here. Let me just save this. And I'm going to save it to the vendor. Just a simple way of getting it integrated. And then we'll go to the application.js and we'll require it here. Now we go into here, and let's just render it out as literally a list. So we'll just do a list ul .map, and then the to-dos that we just passed in, which gets defined. So like this calls the template, then this defines what, this is where it defines what is the property name that's getting passed in, and then this defines the data that gets passed in. So we're going to call props.todos. To do, and then we'll make a li, and we'll just pass in the name. And this is an awesome part about CoffeeScript with React. You can inline maps like this really beautifully. And then let's spin up the server again, and we should be able to see all the list items render out. I just wrote the render syntax wrong, so I'm just gonna fix that. This is how you call the render syntax. Render and then pass the template in. Now we hit refresh, and there we go. It lists out all the C's that we put in. I'm going to quickly add some styles before we keep going, just so you don't have to worry about that for the rest of this. I'm just going to add bootstraps, and then I'm going to add some basic styles. And then I'm going to have to restructure this code just visually a little bit. And this will be good to show you how to write React and CoffeeScript. So let's just add a container. So when you don't have any attributes, you just pass that hash, and when you add attributes, you have to add them like this. Container. Put this over here. We shouldn't even nest this like this. That's just a bootstraps thing. And then when we map over it, let's add that class, which is something I just added, and then we'll add a button. And then we'll add a text. And there we go. Now what we're going to do is break this up into two separate components and add one. So we're going to have the to-do list, and then we're going to have the to-do form. So, and we're also going to use state for our to-dos because we'll be adding to-dos to this. So let's first do get initial state to-dos for that, and then in the component will mount, so before it renders out, we're going to call this dot set state to-dos, this dot props dot to-dos, and that will set the to-dos to the to-dos properties. And then first let's do this and see if that works. Perfect. And let's break this out into two components. So the to-do form and the to-do list. And then we're going to pass in the state of to-dos to the to-do list. So we're going to do to-do list equals, you have to do create factory, react.create factory, because we're using CoffeeScript. Using JSX, you just have to use react.create class. Don't worry too much about that for now. And then we're going to take this code for the list and make that props because it gets passed down. Great. And then to do form. Let me copy again. And let's just render something out. So oops, form group. And then label. I think you just do label. We'll call this enter to do. And then we need the input. We'll add a placeholder. That should be good for the form. And now let's break up this list item into its own component as well. It's good to break things up like this. So you just pass in the props of the to-do. Then we'll do to-do list item equals react.create factory dot class render. Oops, let me get that code actually. Forgot that. Render. There we go. And we're gonna have to make this this dot props dot to do because we're passing it in now instead of getting it from the map. So now we should be able to. Oh wait, I need to add these up here. And now we should be able to. Perfect. And now we have the right components and the breakdown of the form. Now let's make it so we can actually add a to-do. So at the top level component is where you're going to want to add that function. So we're going to call submit to-do. And it's going to get the to-do data. Actually, we'll just pass in the name. And then we're going to be calling an Ajax call. Type post, URL, to-dos, data. Let's pass in the name and then checked false. and then we'll have a success callback with the response. We'll console log that, and then we'll also set the state. Let's do state.todos.push the response, and then we will set state todos to the state.todos after we push it. And then we'll also add an error callback just for posterity. Response. Okay. And now let's go to our controller and let's add in the create code that we'll need. This is just some boilerplate. And this is why I use that partial for JBuilder, so we can actually use the partial that we used to render them out. So we get the to-do, we add a new one. If we save it, then we use that partial, we pass it back, and we accept these parameters. Now let's add a way for the form to actually hit that. Oh, and I actually forgot to scope this correctly, because we're using strong parameters. You have to scope it like that. Let's get some white space down here. Then we'll pass the function down. Submit to do. I'm just going to copy some code because it's a lot of code actually. So basically what we have here is we have the initial state for the input value. We have the onChange handler for when you're hitting the keys and you're typing in the value. And that allows it to actually like set the value of the input. Then when you hit the key down, it checks if it's the enter key and there's actually a value, and if there is, then it submits the to do and then it sets it to blank. So now let's save this and let's go back over here, and now we can do this, and then when I hit enter, it submits it, and then you'll see when I refresh, it actually saved it. Now we can start to move over this data code to Flux, and this will help you with scaling your application up as it gets more complex. So first let's get an implementation of Flux. My current favorite, and I think one of the simplest ones to use, is Alt, made by Josh Perez, Goat Slacker, and he's fantastic and been doing an amazing job with Alt. It's used in production at a few companies. Let's just save it in here. Then let's go to our application, and let's actually move this Lodash and Alt into the components.js. It'll make sense more later when you do pre-rendering. Don't worry about this too much. Require Alt, and then we'll actually have to require an initialize file. And this file will initialize Alt. Window.alt equals new alt. There we go. And now we need to add in a stores folder and an actions folder. And let's add in to do actions and to do store. So we're going to start by just initializing the data that we have with the stores, and then we'll add in the to-do submission and all of that. So class to-do store. So what we have here is a class to-do store. You have to add a display name. This is related to Alt. You bind the actions of the to-do actions, which we'll write in a second. You start by getting your data. This is how you define data. You define this dot whatever data you need, and you initialize it. So your constructor is like your initializer. You set up your actions, you define your data, and then you expose all of the functions that you want your components to call. So you want your components to be able to get the to-dos. So you have to define them in here. So maybe you would also have in find to do if you wanted to get a particular to do out of your data. And then we're going to have an init data callback that we're going to call in the actions. So now let's go to the actions. And we're just going to, it's really simple how actions work in Alt. Basically, they're just like these like setup files. They're super simple. They're just a way to keep everything organized. So we'll have you can make them more complex if you need to, but they provide this awesome generate actions function that keeps you away from the complexity of Flux. So we make a class actions, we generate the action init data, and then we expose it to Windows so the component can access it, and then we call alt.createActions. So now this is how we expose the window.todo actions to the bind actions call here. And that's how you link the actions to the stores. So now let's go to the component, and we're going to set it up so we're no longer using this to initialize the data. Now all we have to do here is actually pretty simple. So instead of taking in the props that get passed down from the component, we're going to call listen to the store. So this basically is just, this component is now permanently listening to the to-do store until it's unmounted. And then we're going to call the to-do action init data. So this thing is listening to the to-do store, and whenever the to-do store changes, it's going to call onChange, which will then set the state of this component to what changed in the to-do store. And then we call init data, which passes the properties in, which is just the to-dos. So that hits the to-do action, then it passes in here, and then that hits on init data, which is how it works. So if you have an action called init data, there's always going to be a corresponding on init data. It gets passed in the to-dos, and then you call set state, and you pass in the props. And then it passes in that data back to the component. So load the component, call will mount, listen to the to-do store, call init data, which then triggers the action, triggers the store, sets the state of the properties, and then this responds and updates it. So then we'll hit save. I think we have to restart our server actually. And then we'll hit refresh, and everything should just look the exact same. And if we did everything right, which we didn't, then it will just render it. To-do store is not defined. Oops, I just have to hit save. Oops, and I don't think I saved that either. There we go. So now the data is rendering out as normal. And so this actually isn't going to work because we broke some things. So we're going to have to rewire up this submit to do function. And actually we have a quick little key thing. So let me add that key. This is just whenever you map over things, you need to have a key for it, so that way it can properly render with React. Now let's move the submit to do functionality into the store and actions. So we're going to add an action in here called submit to do, and then we're going to go to the index. And so the awesomeness of Flux is normally you have to do all this top-down stuff. Since all your data and your store is in your top-level component, you can put your actions directly in your form. So you don't have to do any more of this passing of functions. This will make more sense in a second. So we're actually going to do this code, the actual submission of the data to the store. So on submit to do name, we'll put this here and get rid of this completely because this is just always listening to that store. And now in here, instead of hitting the props.submit to that was passed down, we're just going to call to do actions dot submit to do and then pass in the value. There we go. So that will hit this action, call submit to do. It'll pass in the name into here. It'll still call the Ajax like normal. And actually, I called set state here. What we're actually going to want to do is we're going to want to make this equals to this dot to-dos equals props dot to-dos. You don't want to actually do the set state. It's a little bit different. So we're going to be doing it this way. Then down here, instead of state dot to-dos dot push and set state, we're going to be doing this dot to-dos dot push response. And then we're going to call emit change. And that's going to send out the data change to the components. This is what triggers the listener. So now when we go back to this page, when I hit this, is going through the actions and stores, and it's successfully saving. And the last thing we're going to want to do is add the checked functionality. And we're going to do that using Flux. So this is going to show you what it's like to add a new piece of actions to your component code. So where that's going to happen is in your to-do list item. And we're going to add an on-click handler to the check button. On check to do, and this is going to take the it's going to take no functions, and then it'll call to do actions dot check to do, and we'll pass in just the ID. Actually, we don't need to pass in the whole to do object. Now let's go to the actions. Let's add in here check to do. And the store, we'll need a receiver for that method. And copy paste it in. So on check to do, takes the do ID, calls Ajax, makes a delete call to the to-dos controller, and then on success we use lodash to find the correct to do, and we mark checked equals to true, and then we emit the change. Last thing we'll have to do is go to the controller and add some custom destroy logic in here, so that way it doesn't actually delete it, but it just checks off, it updates it to do with check true. And then it will return once again with the same partial from here and send back the ID, name, and checked. Get the server, hit refresh, click checked. Oops. Don't think that I added in. Nope. Okay. All I have to do here is to-do list classes equals list item. I don't have the visuals correctly updating. And then to-do list classes plus equals checked if props dot to do checked. And we just got to pass that into the class. Now it will properly check them off. Then hit refresh and everything still saves. And now you can implement Flux and with Alt into React and Rails. Now this implementation is really simple and uses sprockets. After doing a lot of coding though with React and Flux and Redux, I find that the React on Rails gem is a better way of integrating in React into my Rails pipeline, but it involves Webpack, it involves Node and NPM, and it's a lot more complex. But if you're trying to build a really scalable app and have a much more in-depth front end that can handle scalability, I would recommend this gem over React Rails. But if you're just trying to simply integrate Flux and React into your Rails app, then this is a great methodology. Thanks. Bye.